Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here with us tonight for our live stream, Street Trees, the critical role they play in environmental and human health. When you think of trees, you might think of a forest or a park, but what about the trees along your street, in parkways, or outside your window? We've got a very special guest this evening to talk about these magnificent, beautiful trees, and Kathy is going to kick us off with an introduction.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, we've talked a lot on this channel so far about our native forbs, our native grasses, our native shrubs, but our trees are just so vitally important. And I mean, I know that in my travels, I see trees coming down. I don't see very many new ones being planted, at least not on residential property. I see people cutting trees down because they don't want to rake leaves anymore. And it just breaks my heart because I know the importance of these amazing trees. And it just seems like we need to kind of all re-educate ourselves in the importance of these trees. And when it comes to this, I'm not even going to be a stickler and say it has to be a native tree. We just need trees out there, not invasive trees, not like calorie pears and stuff, but trees. Just get trees out there. But anyway, I digress. I would like to introduce our very, I'm very excited to introduce this amazing guest. Her name is Cara McLennon, and Cara is a tree steward for the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, which she'll be discussing more about what that is and what they do. And the Chicago Region Tree Initiative is out of the Morton Arboretum in Lisle, Illinois. So whether you're listening to us from Lisle or from Illinois or from whatever state you're in, regardless of where you are in the country, trees are equally important everywhere. Before we get started and before I introduce Cara, I'm just going to ask you if you would please subscribe if you haven't already to our channel. It really helps us out. It helps the algorithm. It helps more people find our content. And consider becoming a member of our channel where we have monthly special live stream for members only. And on those live streams, we present different different content. We might share content with that group before we share it with the general public. We also, at that time, take any questions that you might have about a certain native plant or a landscaping design questions with native plants or native plant issues. So look into that on our YouTube page. And with that, I'm going to stop blabbing and introduce you to Cara McLennon. Welcome, Cara. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Kathy. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited. Howdy, folks. I am here to tell you about street trees and the critical role they play in the environment and human health. So we'll be discussing the value of these trees, the challenges they face living in human spaces, and what you can do to support them, and how the Chicago Region Trees Initiative is going to bat for them and the people that live alongside them. So here you can see, oh, no, hold on. That's the wrong slide. Hello. There we go. Sorry. Street trees are a part of what we call the urban forest or the urban canopy, which encompasses everything from the loop to suburban backyards. Urban forests do not closely resemble true forest, whose complexity and interconnectedness we're only beginning to understand, but there are approximately 172 million trees in Chicagoland alone, living in parks, on streets, in yards, in ditches, and off highways. It's not easy being a street tree. They need a lot of maintenance and support from humans, but I'm going to tell you why the whole song and dance is so worth it, 10 times over. So these are some examples of ecosystem services, which are simply what trees do for humans. They provide fruit, clean air, shade, beauty, and wildlife habitat, but they also do quite a bit of heavy lifting controlling things like stormwater runoff, carbon emissions, crime reduction, and increasing overall human health. Trees are not simply decoration, they are vital infrastructure which very directly impact the environment around them. Trees are, after all, ecosystem builders, and humans do still need to live in ecosystems if we expect to have air and water and ground to stand on. Our biggest talking point in urban forestry, which is taking care of trees in urban environments, is the phenomenon known as the urban heat island effect. And it is the unfortunate side effect of building with so much concrete, tar, and metal. These surfaces absorb and radiate heat like hot coals, even long after the sun is set, as if the humidity in this swamp we call a city didn't do enough of that on its own. When we move out into the suburbs, where the ratio between these surfaces and green cover is much more in our favor, we see decreases in temperatures. When we move a little further still into rural areas, it drops even more. So the solution is, of course, to plant trees, but also to care for those trees for decades to come, to care for the trees that we already have, because more mature trees provide even more benefits than young trees. Benefits like reducing air temperature up to 10 degrees. Just 10% more canopy cover can make a full degree of difference. It's incredibly cost effective and doesn't burn fuel like air conditioning or fans. Quite the opposite. But how do they do that? Well, it comes in part from shade, of course, but it also comes from something called evapotranspiration, which is a big word for Elmo. It is essentially, for our purposes, trees sweating to cool off. But trees don't just cool themselves. They cool the very environment around them because that is what they do. Ecosystem builders, remember? And this effect is exponential. The more trees that are sweating away in our towns and cities, the greater their collective cooling power and the lower our AC bills and the lower our ultimate carbon footprint. Now, this is a map of heat surface temperature from CRTI's interactive priority map, which you can find on the Morton Arboretum website. It shows data like air quality, flood risk, asthma rates, vulnerable populations, and our priority areas based on all of that data. The differences are pretty stark, like Elk Grove Village versus Elk Grove Township, which are right next to each other, just a few miles apart, have a 7-degree median temperature difference because Elk Grove Village has like 33% more tree coverage. It's crazy, right? Another drawback of all that concrete is it is non-permeable. It does not absorb water when it rains, which can lead to flooding. Who here has been personally victimized by floods? Me, right here. Uh, those brilliant Silva engineers do what they can, but water is difficult to control, and the climate is a changing. But trees can absorb a shocking amount of water. Depending on species and maturity, one tree can absorb tens of thousands of gallons in just a growing season. And all that permeable surface isn't stupendously clean either. Urban runoff is polluted. Storm drains flood, sewage drains flood, but trees divert captured rainwater into the soil where bacteria and other microorganisms filter out and break down impurities. This reduces urban runoff and the amount of sediment and pollutants that reach local bodies of water and even drinking water. It also takes some of the strain off your sump pump, so you don't,
Can I
flood your
share,
house.
can I just share something with you when you
Yes, of
come
course,
back
go
here?
ahead.
I used to have a flooding issue in my yard where
Oh
there would
boy.
be standing water for sometimes a week after like very heavy rain because I'm the lowest yard of 6 yards.
Hmm.
I planted a river birch that we were just talking about earlier that I love that tree. And now that that tree is full grown and lovely, I never ever have a drop of standing water in my yard. Never
That
ever.
is such great news. Yeah. Truly, it can just be the difference of planting one tree and it can
Mhm.
just suck up. And really, river birches are such great trees. They tolerate a lot of water, they tolerate not enough water, they tolerate terrible soil conditions, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Let's talk next about erosion control. The roots of trees, shrubs, and the right plants can prevent soil from washing away in those floods we were talking about. And bare and dry soil is more susceptible to erosion due to wind, rain, and snow melt. And this spring, we were just talking about this in Chicagoland, we had what I describe as our first dust storm, certainly in my lifetime. That was weird. Anyway, we ain't supposed to get those. This is technically a swamp. But anyway, areas affected by erosion can cause damage to property and infrastructure and even pose potential falling and slipping risks to pedestrians. Trees provide a mesh for soil to cling to and help retain moisture, significantly reducing erosion. Trees can also remediate soils at landfills and other contaminated sites by absorbing, transforming, and containing a number of contaminants. Air quality. You'll often hear about trees providing oxygen, and that is true, but the majority of our oxygen actually comes from microscopic photosynthetic marine organisms. What trees are real workhorses for is air filtration. They absorb carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, and other pollutants. They also shade cars and parking lots, reducing ozone emissions from vehicles. Yeah, apparently our cars release gas just sitting in the sun. I hate that. A single mature tree can absorb 120 to 240 pounds of particulate pollution in a year. Urban trees in the US remove more than 700,000 metric tons of air pollution annually, doing the equivalent of $3.8 billion worth of work. Billion with a B. Oh, the big one, health benefits. That improved air quality translates to reduced asthma, respiratory, and heart disease rates. Researchers from Columbia University found childhood asthma rates were highest in parts of the city where tree density was lowest. The rates of asthma fell by 25% for every extra 340 trees planted per square kilometer. And that pattern held true even after taking into account differing sources of pollution, levels of affluence, and population density. Patients recovering from surgery in hospital rooms with window views of natural scenery had shorter post-op hospital stays and requested less pain medication. Lower prevalence of Alzheimer's disease by almost 20% and lower risk of depression by almost 30%. Psychological benefits. Psychological well-being improvement from exercising outdoors has shown to be better than just exercising indoors. Exercising in natural environments is associated with greater feelings of revitalization and positive engagement, decreases in intention, confusion, anger, depression, and increased energy. A study on children with attention deficit disorders discovered that the effect of a walk through a park is equal to peak effects of two typical ADHD medications. Carbon sequestration is a significant tool we have in the fight against climate change. Trees reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere by just sucking it up out of the air and using it as building material. We eat protein to build our own mass, and trees get their gains from atmospheric carbon, the very same atmospheric carbon that's driving climate change. And the amount of carbon annually sequestered is increased with the size and health of the tree. Once again, trees only get more useful as they age. Show me a road that does that, a building, any gas-powered machine. That's why preservation and reforestation are so often put forth as key solutions to the climate crisis. I think it's a safe assumption that most of us, as friends of Sag Moraine, strongly believe in native plants and ecology based on principle, but the economics of the matter are nothing to sneeze at. The value of the urban forests in Chicago alone totals to $2.3 billion, and that number is calculated based on those ecosystem services we discussed. Cheaper heating and cooling, reduced flooding and erosion damage, as well as increased traffic to businesses and storefront areas in areas with more tree cover. Canopy cover even reduces crime rates. This is in part due to reducing heat, which is linked to violence, and in part by improving resident mental health, but we also can't separate the socioeconomic correlation. Where there's poverty, there's crime, because desperation does not bring out the best in us, because certain neighborhoods are more heavily policed than others, and under-resourced areas just don't have the resources to plant or maintain their urban canopy, adding further strain to its residents. Trees are yet another piece of vital infrastructure that's largely inaccessible to those who need it most. Oh, it really thought about that one, huh? This is a map of the infamous redlining by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s in Chicagoland, where home loans and insurance were limited or entirely withheld in specific areas based on the race and income of its residents. And here's a map of modern tree cover in Chicagoland. Almost a century later, and the maps are nearly one-to-one, aren't they? The red-lined, still largely black neighborhoods have little to no tree cover, and so their residents don't receive the protection of trees to their homes, health, and finances. It is the mission of the Chicago Region Trees Initiative to combat such inequalities however we can, but we'll get to that shameless plug later. First, I want to talk more about the unique struggles of the urban trees. In a natural forest, trees face things like lightning strikes, disease, herbivore browse, beavers. And urban trees face all of that and then some. Collision with cars, lawnmowers, weed whackers, kids with pocket knives, poor soil, soil compaction, pollution, tiny growing spaces that people in my office call death boxes, worsened drought and heat island effect, it affects them too. road salt, humans who cut them down because they don't like raking leaves, or poor initial planning and higher risk of disease and invasive species due to proximity with humans. But they also have the attention and love of humans who know what they're worth, and I think we can mitigate a lot of these problems. But what we can't so easily mitigate is true woodland trees have support from one another. Physical support against wind and storms, making them much less likely to come down, but also sharing resources beneath the soil. Trees have symbiotic relationships with what are called mycorrhizal fungi, and they provide nutrients in exchange for sugars from the tree. And it also allows trees to be interconnected with one another under the soil, allowing them to share resources and sugars with each other, sometimes even between different species, because it makes the forest stronger as a whole, and each individual within a stronger forest are better off. But it would be I'm getting ahead of myself. There's been some research into how we can introduce these mycorrhizal fungi when we plant trees, and how we can provide more space for street trees to spread their roots and connect to one another. It could extend their lives and therefore extend our lives, but that would involve significant infrastructure changes and costs, so we shall see. Let's talk about disease. Those injuries from the mowers and the knife kids can provide opportunity for arboreal diseases, most of which are fungal, like the infamous Dutch elm disease. Some infections can be treated with fungicides, especially if they're caught early, but many, like the Dutch elm disease, are kind of just fatal. Even if it takes a few years to kill the tree, trees do die slowly. Some are spread by insects, some by soil, and some by careless pruners who do not sanitize their tools in between trees. Oaks especially are vulnerable to disease, and it's important to never, ever, ever prune an oak or an elm anytime but winter for that exact reason. So let's go over some invasive species that threaten our urban trees. Not all of them, or we'd be here all day, but invasive species are especially prevalent in urban and suburban settings. Invasive plants are generally pioneer species, which means they do super well in disturbed areas. Pardon me, I just had dinner. And humans make a lot of disturbed areas. They get their hooks in faster than anyone else and crowd out any competitors by sheer numbers. These are just a few of the invasive plants that compete specifically with trees. Now, why is garlic mustard a biennial understory in the Competes with Native Trees Club? Well, it's because it competes with saplings, especially little baby oaks. And if there's no little baby oaks, eventually there will be no oaks at all. So, you see garlic mustard, kill on sight. And it is edible. They don't call it garlic mustard for nothing. People make pesto out of it, in fact. I've never tried it myself, but it was originally brought over from Europe as a food source, so it does make sense. This is European buckthorn. She gets her own slide because I hate her, and she is number one, public enemy number one. By far the most common tree in Chicagoland is the invasive buckthorn. 45% of Chicagoland's canopy is invasive, and 36% is just buckthorn. It is still spreading and still increasing, as you can see on this graph. Look at that
Where did
population
that come
go.
from? Where did that awful buckthorn come from, Cara?
It was originally brought over as an ornamental plant from Europe in the late 1800s, which doesn't scan to me at all because it's so ugly. But I'm not biased at all. Look at that growth, even compared to a more honeysuckle, which is another invasive species, let alone the natives like green ash there, which is dropping, of course, poor thing. They crowd out native trees and plants, take over any area they can get their hooks in, and they don't provide nearly as much benefits as larger, longer lived tree because buckthorns just sort of, they don't live that long and they just kind of have this cycle of constantly reseeding. And they do that because their seeds are distributed by birds that like the berries, despite the horrible and sometimes fatal diarrhea it gives said birds and the valuable nutrients it does not give said birds. And like I said, originally brought over for ornamental purposes, I can't see that because it's just not a pretty tree. We can also talk about invasive insects. I'll go over just three of the big ones. The very first is spongy moth, named for their weird foamy egg cases. At their most destructive, They're at their most destructive when they are hungry little caterpillars. They can defoliate more than 13 million acres of woods in one season. And they really like oaks, which is very strange because oaks are pretty good at being unpalatable to most things. They have very dense leaves and they have a lot of tannins. But other susceptible species include alder, apple, aspen, birch, hawthorn, larch, and linden.
Okay, can I ask you something
Yeah,
about
wanna go
this
back?
here? Because we talk a lot on this channel in general about how
Mm-hmm.
wonderful our Lepidoptera are, how wonderful, moths are and butterfly
Mm-hmm.
caterpillars are for our ecosystem and for the food chain and so on. And so people are going to look, but then people will say, but there's moths that are, destroying trees. Moths are
Mm-hmm.
bad. Caterpillars can be bad. Like these ones that are bad these are not our native insects, correct?
No,
These are
these are invasive
invasives that
insects.
came from elsewhere and they have decided to feast on
Mm-hmm.
our native trees.
Yes, they have. And the thing is about local native caterpillars and butterflies and things is that they have been here for a long time and they have a balance has been found in the ecosystem. Those caterpillars may defoliate a lot of trees, but they get eaten up by birds, they have natural predators. I suppose that is not so for the spongy moth. And that's why it's so important that we stick with natives because we don't really know how well they're going to mesh with the ecosystem. The spotted lanternfly is another terrible invasive. It has not yet made its way to Chicagoland as far as I know, but it has been spotted in Illinois in the last couple of years, which is why I'm highlighting it, because early prevention can make a world of difference. The spotted lanternfly's primary and perhaps sole host for its eggs is the invasive tree of heaven, but it'll feed on and kill a number of native trees, including oak, walnut, tulip tree, willow, and maples. It's kind of annoying how pretty they are, honestly. But even so, if you spot a spotted lanternfly, kill on site and report it. And then we get on to the infamous emerald ash borer. This little bug is responsible for the death of well over 6 million trees in Chicago and somewhere between 7 and 9 billion nationally. Using a lot of billions today, aren't I? According to the Arbor Day Foundation. Just this one little bug. We talked about the health benefits of trees, and we talked about air cleaning services of trees, but this one insect really puts all of that in perspective. According to a study published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, the infestation of emerald ash borer led to the loss of over 10 million trees in the study area, and the loss of those trees to this specific insect was linked to an increase in cardiovascular and respiratory deaths, human deaths, because we lost trees. Across the 15 Midwestern states in the study area, which includes Illinois, the borer was associated with an uptick of more than 6,000 deaths related to respiratory illness and 1,500 deaths related to cardiovascular disease. Truth be told, it is not that trees improve human health, it is that a lack of trees damage human health. They are not simply a nice thing to have, they are vital infrastructure that correlate directly with our own well being. And an important way to prevent that is not don't move firewood. The general rule is do not move firewood more than 10 miles and never across state lines. So buy it where you burn it, as they say. Untreated wood harbors disease and invasive species like the spongy moth. It's believed that this is how the spongy moth got its way in and how it spreads. Emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease, all kinds of things can come in just on firewood. Some managed forests have completely banned outside firewood for this reason, but keeping our firewood local can help reduce the spread of these destructive infections and protect our trees from invasions. Overall, it's not looking super good for urban canopies. They are projected to decline across the US, largely due to urban expansion and the recent trend in loss of urban tree cover and increase in impervious cover. Impervious cover being the roads, sidewalks, parking lots, and buildings previously discussed. But invasive species, disease, and climate change, of course, play their ugly part. 6 of the 7 counties in Chicago have been slowly increasing their canopy, but the city of Chicago proper has been decreasing. And not all of the growth we have is ideal. Remember how nearly half of our trees are invasive. So, what can we do about that? That's kind of scary. Uh, what can we do to protect the urban trees whom we rely upon so much? Well, you're off to a great start informing yourselves. Plant natives and learn how to properly care for them. Avoid cutting down healthy trees needlessly and push for tree protection ordinances and learn how to properly care for trees. I think most people do not care a lot about, or I think most people do care a lot about their local trees. They just don't really know anything about them and don't quite realize that they're living creatures that can't just be stuck in the ground and abandoned. But what I don't want is people getting mad at every city or village employee when taking down trees, because usually, not always, as we were discussing earlier, usually they're not going to remove trees unless they're dead, dying, sick, or some kind of hazard, because it costs them money to take these things out. Municipal trees are at least supposed to be protected, and in most areas, they generally are. But 70% of Chicagoland's trees grows on private property, most of which don't have any kind of legal protection. And that's what we need desperately is legal protections for those trees. I've
Okay,
watched neighbors.
let me
Oh,
just pop
yes,
in
go
here.
ahead.
What about parkways? Parkways are technically belong
Mhm.
to the municipality.
Those would technically be municipality trees, yeah.
So should those be, are those currently protected? It doesn't seem like it.
We were just talking about it. In most places that I know of, they are, but every municipality is different, which is very frustrating. I agree.
Mhm.
Yeah, they are supposed to be protected, but not always. Let's see, where was I?
Not where I live. I'm not going to mention any names.
Yeah. Oh, I am. Well, I've watched neighbors of my own in Lisle take out 300-year-old oak trees simply because they feel like it. Or I had other neighbors who desperately wanted to preserve some heritage oaks growing in the yard when they were building their new house, but the village of Lisle doesn't require arborists on new build sites. So the construction guys came in and drove all over those roots, and they lost almost every single, no, not almost, they did lose every single one within the year. Which brings me to the fragility of tree roots, which is something that a lot of people, I think, don't fully appreciate. How fragile tree roots can be. Compaction of the roots is analogous to having your lungs and blood vessels crushed. They're especially vulnerable to construction. New buildings rarely, if ever, preserve nearby trees because the huge machines crush their roots, usually killing them within a couple of years. And if you look at this infographic here, you'll see just how far out the tree roots grow. Most trees, their roots don't go further down than like 19 inches, with some exceptions. They spread out. And when those roots are crushed by big machines, they're kind of toast. So ideally, we would have arborists that come out and set up fencing around these trees. And there's not really a standardized, rule on how far out, but it's better than nothing. So with any new construction, big machines need to stay off these roots, or you're going to be spending thousands taking out a dead tree within the next couple of years. And they have to spend more on AC without all that shade. But even foot traffic, if there's enough foots, can be a burden on a tree's roots, which is yet another burden that the street trees bear. So, how do we care for trees? Well, for one, when it gets very hot out, especially in this climate changey kind of summers we've been getting, it's good to give those trees some water. The ones in your yard, the ones on your street. Uh, Put a hose near the base, not on the trunk or on the foliage, and just let it run for a few minutes on a hot day, assuming the soil in that area isn't already wet most of the time. Keep an eye out for invasives and call the free plant clinic at the Morton Arboretum if you think there's something wrong with your tree, and they'll see if it needs to be treated, and they can even hook you up with an arborist if you like. You can take pictures, send them an email. It's a free service we provide to anyone and everyone with plant-related questions. But what do I mean by mulch correctly? I'm so glad you asked. This is my personal nemesis, the volcano mulch ring. If y'all take anything away from this, my friends, donuts, not volcanoes. Well-meaning gardeners and busy landscapers alike fall prey to this improper mulch application that can weaken and kill trees. Mulch piled onto the root flare and bark encourages rot and insects to make it difficult for the trees to breathe from its root flare. So spread that mulch out into a donut, get it off the trunk, and your trees will be much happier. And I'll warn you, once you see this problem, you will never stop seeing it. It's absolutely everywhere, which is why I'm screaming to the heavens, donuts, not volcanoes. Please, people. So I'm sure you're wondering, Kara, what should I plant? In my yard? On my street? Well, we have to consider these hostile environments, don't we? What species do I recommend? That is a very big question because there are a number of factors to consider. There's a lot of people called arborists whose entire jobs are considering these factors. Uh, but the great news is there are a number of species that can survive and even thrive in these terrible conditions we've described, as long as we practice right tree, right place. So we have to consider the structural integrity of the species to avoid falling limbs and falling. If you're planting under power lines, you have to consider the tree's mature size, or they'll get one of those terrible haircuts from the poor utility guys that are just trying to prevent outages and fires. We also have to consider, how likely is this? Oh, hold on. Will residents hate that it drops fruit on the sidewalk, for example? Generally, it's outside. Don't worry about it. But I know someone whose workplace has a female ginkgo out front, and yeah, I'm seeing on someone's face. Trees in general don't come in male and female, but ginkgos do. And they can change their sex whenever they feel like it. So you might plant a male or accidentally plant a female, but the males might eventually, turn into females and they start dropping this incredibly stinky fruit. That is not ideal. So that is something to consider when you're planting a tree on the street. They are very good trees. They're not native ginkgos, but they are excellent trees, but you do have to watch out for the stink fruit. Um, Another factor to consider is do you want something that has pretty flowers? Do you have alkaline soil or acidic soil? How wet is the area? How dry? It's kind of overwhelming. So I highly recommend the Northern Illinois tree species list. I believe it's going to be linked somewhere, but you can also just, Google it. Um, it's this beautiful chart with all these considerations and more to help you choose the right tree for the right place. I have to refer to it myself all the time to maintain the illusion that I know what I'm talking about. But I'm going to give you all the short list. So first and foremost, I am duty bound to recommend oaks, not just because they're my personal favorite genus, but because Illinois is oak savanna country. Prior to European colonization, this land was dominated by oak forests and prairies. All trees are ecosystem builders, but oaks really are the keystone species. Over 326 species depend solely and entirely on oaks. There's ballpark of like 500 species of oaks, not even including cultivars and hybrids, of which there are many because oaks are what we call promiscuous. That's a botanical term for species that make crossbreeds very easily. So I'm going to tell you about the types that we plant. We've got bur oak, white oak, swamp chestnut oak, and shingle oak, all of which I highly recommend to use in urban and suburban experiences. Bur oaks are tolerant of a lot of soil types and have like this cool, craggly, funky shape to them that makes me one of my favorites. White oaks probably have the best acorn output for wildlife and also a very beautiful fall color. The two swamp species are ideal for wet areas with poor drainage. And Hills oak is a Chicagoland native type of oak that's tougher than other pin oaks, which can be fussy about their soil and are vulnerable to chlorosis, which is something you might see around where if you look at the leaf of the tree and it's kind of yellow on the outside and green in the center, that's chlorosis, which is usually an issue with the soil not having the right nutrients in it.
You say the shingle oak is smaller. A lot of people ask us, they know how
Mhm.
important oaks are and they'd love to
Yes.
plant oaks, but they really don't feel like they have enough room on their property. How, when you say shingle oak is smaller, how much smaller?
They're not tiny. Like they're still relatively big. If you really want something small, there are dwarf varieties that you can choose from. We don't normally plant them, but
Mhm.
they are available. So,
So there are dwarf cultivars of oak.
yes, there are dwarf cultivars of oak. I'm not thinking of any off the top of my head, but I do know they exist. I've seen them before.
Okay.
But let's also talk about the other species of trees that we can plant because it can't just be oaks. It is massively important that we plant a diversity of species. So bald cypress and river birch are good for poorly drained soils. Pardon me. And bald cypress is one of the only deciduous conifers, which means that they drop their needle leaves. They turn this stunning golden color in the fall, drop them all, and then regrow their soft little needles in the spring. And the river birch is also very drought tolerant in addition to tolerating wet areas. They're really tough trees. Serviceberry is a genuinely small tree, small enough to go under power lines, and they also have delicious fruit and beautiful flowers. Magnolias and tulip trees also bloom gorgeously, though magnolias don't love salt, so we kind of avoid putting them right by the road. The New Horizon elm is an American elm hybrid bred specifically to resist Dutch elm disease. London plane tree is an American sycamore hybrid that actually kind of cropped up on its own in urban environments, but it is hotly contested where it first hybridized. Kentucky coffee tree might be my personal favorite, but because they tolerate a wide range of polluted soils and look so good doing it, you know? They're named for these like yay-sized beans that they produce, and they were once used by early settlers as a coffee substitute, which is strange, difficult to say why, because they contain no caffeine or stimulants and they are slightly poisonous. So, um, but each species has her own unique considerations and her own unique role to play in the urban forest. These are just a few of the species that we at CRTI use, and you can check out the Morton Arboretum website for all the info you could ever want on these trees and a whole lot more. And next, I'd like to talk about why natives. Maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's worth saying. All of that is great, but why do you keep harping on native trees, Kara? A tree's a tree, isn't it? Ha ha ha! No! Everything I've talked about that trees do, native trees just kind of do better because they've been here for millions of years, adapting and evolving together into a complex, efficient ecosystem. And nothing sequesters carbon, cleans air, absorbs water, radiates beauty like a healthy ecosystem. I'm sure some of you have observed those native plants as well, but native wildlife don't always engage with non-natives in the same way. And it's unclear how good for them some of these novel food sources are. Some of you may already know about tropical milkweed, for example, which alters monarch migratory behavior, essentially tricking the butterflies into sticking around too long in the fall and dying in the cold instead of migrating south. We still don't fully understand the individual relationships between native wildlife and the huge amount of non-native trees commercially available. We really have no way of knowing what will turn out to be invasive. That being said, it's not a hard rule. I'm not a particular, puritanical on native trees either. A number of the trees that we plant, like the New Horizon elm I mentioned, is a hybrid between a native and non-native species. But that elm cultivar was again specifically developed to be resistant to Dutch elm disease. And it does, it is resistant to elm disease. But, if we're not going to have any elms left if we don't help them adapt. But let's talk next about what not to plant then. I ask that you pretty please not plant any invasives, like the Bradford pear or the aforementioned tree of heaven, the latter of which you'll remember is the host of the invasive spotted lanternfly, which is also beautiful, but also kills trees. And we're fighting hard to keep them out of Illinois. And no Bradford pears, please. They're pretty, but they're not as pretty as crab apples, and crab apples don't stink like rotting fish. So, I also recommend that you avoid maples, actually, even the native ones. They're not bad trees by any means, but they're kind of overplanted and they're already very good at planting themselves, so their population's doing pretty good. What's more, they're not the most structurally sound tree. They're kind of live fast, die young. Urban trees all are by circumstance, but maples especially. It's why so many people plant them because they grow fast. But fast growing trees have much airier, weaker wood, and so they are more prone to breaking in storms. And on the subject of overplanting, it is massively important that we plant, again, a diversity of species, lest we fall prey to the mistakes of the past. Longtime Chicago residents will remember that the city was once lush with ash trees lining the streets like green arches, and they made up the bulk of the urban canopy, what we call a monoculture. And all it took was one invasive species, the emerald ash borer, to wipe out half of them. And that's why it's so vital to plant many different species, so that when a pest or disease comes through again, and it will, our urban forest is diverse enough to withstand it. A lot of city planners don't realize this, and you'll see entire neighborhoods planted with like honey locusts, which is one of my favorite trees, do not get me wrong, but that monoculture might come to bite us. Which brings me to the shameless self-plug of the Chicago Region Trees Initiative. What is the Chicago Region Trees Initiative you keep bringing up, Kara? Well, thank you so much for asking, my curious audience. The Chicago Region Trees Initiative, or CRTI, if I say it enough times, maybe people will remember that mouthful. We are the Urban and Community Forestry Program of the Morton Arboretum. CRTI works to improve the health, diversity, and equitable distribution of trees in the Chicago region and throughout Illinois. We conduct free community tree plantings, help residents pass tree protection ordinances in their communities, consult municipalities, provide educational outreach, collect urban tree canopy data, offer grants, and so much more. We plant about 1,000 trees a year on average, and with your help, we can plant even more. Check out the wealth of information and programs that we offer on Morton Arboretum's website, and you could join our wonderful volunteers to help plant some trees. Or if somewhere in your neighborhood is hurting for more trees, maybe we could help. Want to harass your local government in protecting your local community's trees from schmoes who feel like cutting them down because they don't want to rake leaves? Hit us up. We do too. Check out the Morton Arboretum website. We'd love to talk to you. And thank you so much for listening to me ramble about trees. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something. I hope you feel inspired to fight for your trees like they fight for you. And I'd love to move on to questions. That's my favorite part.
Cara, I actually have a question. So
Yippee.
I lived downtown in the city for many, many years, and I remember my dad mentioning to me that, they planted a lot of honey locusts and they planted a lot of ginkgos just because of like the sewer and storm system that it could handle those leaves better. Do you know if there's
Mhm.
any truth to that or like why they
You
chose
know,
those particular trees?
I don't know. Certainly, like, say, oak leaves, for example, are not great for the gutters and whatnot because they break down very slowly. It takes an oak leaf on average like 3 years to fully decompose. And those trees do have leaflets instead of like true leaves. So it's a compound leaf. So yeah, I don't know definitively, but it does sound like it would probably be easier simply because the leaves are smaller.
Yeah, definitely on the
Yeah.
honey locust. And
Hmm.
it's interesting too, the ginkgo, like if you look at some of our municipal buildings in downtown Chicago, there's so many ginkgos down there. And when you start
Yeah.
to realize it, you're like, wow, they're everywhere.
And they're great trees. They're gorgeous and they're also incredibly ancient. There's several cultivars, but they're all based off of only one species, the only surviving species of their genus. And they actually evolved before bees did, and they were originally pollinated by beetles. Isn't that wild?
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, right. And honey locust, the honey locust that we see in cities is actually a cultivar that was bred to not have spikes because the wild honey locust, and sometimes older trees will revert, have these like crazy long, scary looking spikes. And those were originally to protect them from extinct megafauna that the trees just haven't noticed aren't gone yet.
Oh, wow, is that interesting?
Yeah, I'm going on a
So
tangent,
was
but.
that like protecting them from dinosaurs?
It was protecting them from giant ground sloths, actually. North America used to have
A
giant ground
giant
sloths.
ground sloth. So how big were the giant ground sloths?
They were huge, like elephant sized, I think, ballpark.
Really?
Yeah, massive critters.
Did they look like sloths?
Kinda, but they're so big, it's really hard to like. That's not a sloth, right? Isn't that crazy?
Would you talk a little bit like if people are concerned in their neighborhood, whether they're in Illinois or
Hmm.
elsewhere,
Hmm.
but obviously especially in Illinois, if they're concerned about, their lack of tree cover in their neighborhood and seeing people take down trees and seeing trees not go
Hmm.
up, what is the best thing for them to do if they're concerned in general, not just, they
Hmm.
maybe have some trees on their property, but they see the story of what's going on around them. What actions can they take?
Well, there's a lot of options. In the city of Chicago, you can call, I believe it's 331 or 311. I'm drawing a blank now, to request a tree planted on your parkway. And they kind of have to do it. Sometimes you have to, bother them a little bit, but you can get trees planted that way. There are also programs like CRTI. We do street plantings. Open Lands does a lot of plantings. There are a lot of really cool nonprofit programs that would love nothing more than to plant some trees for you for free. And all you really need to do is reach out.
So is there like what does a neighborhood or a suburb or what, I mean, because I know this is trying to bring about, tree equity, so you probably
Mhm.
are not going to do as many projects if it's a suburb that's like extremely lush with trees or something, right? So
Yes.
and I had once heard, like, can you talk a little bit about um the process of having a tree census? Is that
Yes,
something
that's something we also offer. It is not my department, so I don't know the full details of it. But yes, we do offer tree censuses. And places like we've done censuses for schools that are trying to get accredited as arboretums. And schools and private property, if they meet the requirements of being accredited as an arboretum, can be offered all kinds of grants and cool opportunities that can help them support that urban forest. So not everything has to be completely out of pocket. So there are cool programs. It's just most people don't really know about them, and we're trying to get the word out about it.
wonderful? We
Hmm.
got to get those trees back out there, everyone.
We
They're so
do.
important.
And it is
It's
also
so
so important to
depressing.
protect them, you know?
Yes.
I
And it's
really,
just so
we have,
depressing to see them coming down
mhm,
and you don't see many small trees. I mean, I look
mhm,
around and as I drive around a lot of neighborhoods, I see bigger shade trees, many of which, like you mentioned, like the maples, they have
mhm,
a limited lifespan, and some of them
that
seem
they
to
do.
be, getting beyond their prime,
Yes.
and I see very few smaller trees that have been planted within the last 10 years. And it's like, my gosh, as these big trees go, these big maples go, we're gonna have
Mhm.
nothing.
And that's a good point because when we lost so many trees to the emerald ash borers, of course, we planted a lot more trees, but that was like going on 50, 60 years ago, which is about the average lifespan of a street tree. So we are seeing right now a lot of those trees are seeing the end of their lifespan and desperately need to be replaced. So
Mhm,
excellent point. Yeah. We really do
mhm,
need to be planting as many trees as we can and preserving the ones that we have.
absolutely.
Mhm.
Well,
Here,
thank you so much. Any other questions?
I have a question. What
What is
is
that?
CRTI?
You got
Uh,
it. Yeah, there you
yeah,
go.
and the Arboretum, how are they sort of approaching the areas of Chicago and under-resourced communities that need trees, but don't necessarily have a population that can take care of the tree? There's a lot of apartments, there's a lot of abandoned buildings. So my understanding is that there's interest in planting trees there. But
Mhm.
then the question is like, who's gonna water the tree? Who's gonna mulch?
Yes.
Who's gonna take care of the tree? Like a homeowner is much more likely to water a tree in front of their house, but someone living in an apartment building or just a business that an empty lot.
Mhm. That's an excellent question. Yeah. I really want to encourage people to have a sense of ownership over trees that aren't just on their own private property. These trees are to our collective benefit, and we really need to be doing better for them. So, oof.
What if a town it has tried to do tree initiatives in the past and people don't want the trees in their parkway? They
Mhm.
complain they don't want it. They, because they don't want to take care of it or they don't want to rake leaves. Um, like, what is your suggestion? I mean, like it was talked about in, a town that I'm aware of trying to precede the actual, planting of trees or offering of trees with an educational seminar or something offered to the town, to the residents about the importance of this and why the town is taking on this initiative. Do you have any insight of what will be a good way to go about that?
Honestly, sometimes you just have to have conversations with your neighbors. These seminars are really great, but they largely attract people who are already interested and already care about trees.
Hmm.
And to Lindsay's point, like we can plant trees, but someone needs to take care of them. And that is very much the responsibility of the community. So we at CRTI need to build a relationship with our community, and our partners need to further build the relationship with their community too. And that's not easy. That's a whole lot of boots on the ground individual work. And we need to build a network of people who care about trees. You're right, and it's not easy, but I believe in us.
I'm going to try to be as optimistic as
Hmm.
you, but when I saw 9 shade trees come down within a block of my house one day last summer,
Yeah.
you didn't want to be near me that day.
Mm.
I think
I
poor Lexi was, or the next day. She was like, bah!
I so appreciate your passion on that. But yeah, sometimes you need people who are ready to go to bat, and some people need to be gentle parented. And I
Mhm.
think you could take that energy to your local city council and drum up some interest in passing local tree ordinances that would protect those trees more. on private and public property.
So do you know of, so you don't have to name the names of any towns, but like, do you know of some towns that actually have protections for trees on private property?
You know, I first heard about it when I was in Houston, Texas, and I was very surprised to learn about that they have quite strict regulations there. You have to have a permit to take any tree down, so they can make sure it's not one of the protected trees. There's got to be some in Illinois, but I don't know any personally. I haven't encountered them, but I'd love to hear about it because that would be a great, it sets precedent, you know? Like
Mm-hmm.
my own town, I live in Lisle, the Arboretum Village, and we only have protections for certain species on municipal property. And they take very good care of their street trees. But like I said, 70% of Chicago's canopy is on private property and is not protected. So I guess it's on us to pass those ordinances.
There we go. We have marching orders.
Yeah, baby.
Well, this was awesome, Cara. Thank you so much for sharing this. It's enlightening. I guess it's a little bit depressing, but
Yeah.
we have to face reality before we can do anything about it. And I'm just going to leave everybody with please, oh, please plant trees and please tell others
Mhm.
that you know and care about or that you have any influence over. Please ask them to plant trees.
And you don't have to do it alone. We can be united in this front. And I think Chicago is becoming kind of a beginning of a movement, for cities to really take ownership of their urban canopies. So thank you guys so much for having me. I really love talking about trees, and I hope we can make progress this way.
Well, thank you for joining us and thank you everyone for
Mhm.
joining us and we will see you at our next presentation.
Hit us up at CRTI. Bye.